January 29th, 2021. It's a quiet Friday morning in Buffalo, New York, the state's second largest city, fondly known as the City of Good Neighbors.
Sometimes we get overshadowed by New York City, but with Buffalo, there's a lot of heart. It's not a small town, but it has a small town family feel. People tend to know each other, grew up together.
The reasons why it's called the City of Good Neighbors is because when a crisis hits, you will see your neighbors come to help you.
And one local family may soon find themselves in need of support.
It was about maybe 7, 8 in the morning.
Ronisha White received a video call from her sister, Tierra Lott. And when she saw her sister on the screen, it was obvious that something was wrong.
One side of her face was swollen.
Sierra, slow down. What's going on?
She just kept saying, I gotta get out, I gotta get out.
To 22-year-old Tierra Lott, family was everything.
It was really close. Talked on the phone every day. And Mom first, but we joked and played, danced.
You couldn't see her and not see her sisters right behind her. Kids-wise, we was always together, sharing the same room. If I went outside, she had to come outside type of thing.
I've had moments of her just busting in my room, jumping on me, like that was my person.
To everyone who knew her, Tierra was the life of the party.
She was crazy, but she was a good crazy though, like outgoing, fun, like talkative.
Tierra was always just silly, always cracking jokes on somebody.
She always made you laugh, made you happy.
But she also had a more sensitive side.
Tierra was a loving, caring person.
She was a sweetheart.
She will give you a chance with her heart on her sleeve. She always showed up when I needed her. She will give you the shirt off her back.
Although Tierra left high school early, education always remained important to her.
She ended up going for her GED at Urban League.
Soon after, she began a career in home health care.
Once she started doing the home care, she fell in love with doing that. She was just a workaholic. You never seen her.
When she enrolled in college to become a medical assistant, it seemed like a perfect fit.
It definitely was up her alley.
She put a lot into her schooling, and she always reached for the sky. She always wanted better.
And when she wasn't working, she loved spending time with her boyfriend, Andre Wiggum.
She met her boyfriend, Andre, through a close mutual friend.
She was happy, and he made her happy.
But Tierra wasn't only finding success in love.
She was about to start a new job.
She was really excited.
She definitely did have so much going for her.
Only now, Tierra has called her sister bruised and swollen.
I gotta get out of here. Okay, well, what do you need from me? What can I do? I don't know. My stuff is already packed. Oh, okay, well, what? Tierra.
She told me she had everything packed up, ready to go in the kitchen. She just gotta go.
But not long after, Ronisha received a worrying message.
She had sent a text message.
She said, God forbid anything happened to me. I love y'all.
Immediately, Ronisha texts her sister back.
I said, I love you too, but don't talk like that. But there wasn't no answer, no text back or anything like that.
She never responded.
What's happening?
"22-year-old Tierra Lott was going strong with her 27-year-old boyfriend, Andre Wiggum.
He made her happy. She really loved him.
This was like her boot.
Tiara's professional life was also taking off.
She had just got that new job. She was excited.
But now, her sister Ronisha fears she could be in trouble.
When Tiara called Ronisha with a bruised face, she told her to leave from where she was. She said she was about to.
But not long after Ronisha hung up, she got an ominous message from her sister.
She had sent a text message stating that I love y'all and to tell everyone else that I love them too. When I tried to contact her, I couldn't get through.
And Tiara never texted back.
With rising concern, Ronisha begins contacting family members.
Yeah, I don't know. Something's wrong.
I reached out to my sister. I asked her, did she speak with her? She said no, she had missed calls from her, but she was sleeping at that time. I contacted my mother, explained to her what's going on.
Ronisha was saying that she can't get through to Tiara. That bothered me that day. We started calling, and we couldn't get no answers.
And that evening, the family decides it's time to take action.
She's not calling back. She's not on Facebook. That's when we knew something wasn't right.
The family assumed Tiara was calling from her boyfriend's place.
Thought maybe they got into it. You know, maybe her phone broke.
She had her own apartment, but for the last few months, she'd been staying over there a lot.
But her family doesn't know much about him.
I saw pictures of him and stuff like that, but I never got a chance to meet Andre.
We've never been around him. He don't be out anywhere we be out.
Which means they don't know where he lives.
We knew the street, we just didn't know the physical address.
But the family doesn't let that stop them.
We went over there searching up and down the street, trying to figure out which house it was.
The street is a really long street. It's like 4 blocks all the way down. This was a process.
We were knocking on doors, but nobody wasn't trying to give us no information.
Then they finally make contact with Tiara's friend who'd introduced the couple, who also happens to be related to Andre.
She knew what house it was.
She was pretty close with Andre, and if something was wrong, she wanted to help.
Moments after getting the information from her, Tiara's sisters are at Andre's front door.
We went banging on the door. There wasn't no answer. The door is locked.
Immediately, Ronisha calls Tiara's friend back, asking if she can help get them inside.
Yeah, can you get me into Andre's house?
She said, well, y'all, if y'all just come pick me up, then I can try to get y'all in the house.
Okay, we're coming to get you.
But when they return with Tiara's friend, they immediately notice something is off.
We get out the car. I said, hold on. They had a motion light. The motion light was working when we first got there. When we came back, the motion light was off, completely off. So I'm like, hold on, that's strange. Now the door is left open. So I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. That don't seem right.
Tiara! Andre! Tiara!
Tiara's sisters quickly proceed in the house.
Everybody turning flashlights on their phones so we can see what's going on. We're screaming his name and my sister's name.
Tiara! Andre!
Not only is no one inside, but they also find the house in disarray.
Everything is just scattered like somebody left out of there in a rush. I see the belongings that Tiara said she had packed up and ready to go in the middle of the kitchen floor. Now I'm panicking. Where is my sister?
But before Tiara's sisters have a chance to react, they're interrupted.
What are y'all doing here? We're looking for our sister Tiara.
She's trying to play like she lives here. This is her house. She's been living here for this amount of time.
Get out! Where's Tiara?
She said she never seen Tiara here ever in her life.
But if this woman is a roommate of Andre's, Ronisha is sure she is lying.
Not only are Tiara's things in that house, but Ronisha knew her sister had been spending the night at her boyfriend's house a lot.
So she contacts their mother.
My mom said to just grab Tiara's stuff and leave.
Within hours, the family decides it's time to get the police involved.
We went to the police, and that's the day that they sent the police officer over there to meet us.
They did a little welfare check, but, of course, no sign of her.
So tell us what exactly happened.
They say when they spoke with her via FaceTime, they did notice bruises on her face.
We showed them the text. God forbid if anything happened to her, that she loved us. That's basically what alerted us.
And you haven't heard anything since?
No, we couldn't get through.
We knew that she was in harm because she don't do that. She answer her phone. She don't go off of Facebook. She stay in social media.
But now she's nowhere to be found.
They said that the house is disarrayed and like somebody left in a hurry.
And she was staying here with her boyfriend. Can you tell us about him?
I mean, not much.
The family states they don't know Andre that well.
When she was with him, he'd be in the background. And I was like, when I'm gonna meet him? Or I tell her to put him on the phone and she'd just giggle, that silly laugh. Tierra kept him at bay.
For now, the police don't seem too concerned.
When you're a Black 22-year-old woman, they figure you're grown or what have you, so Tierra wasn't a priority from law enforcement.
But she is a priority to her family.
We know her. You can't tell us about our child. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't tell us anything.
Okay, well, let us know when you get more information.
So they take matters into their own hands.
Tierra's mom, Pat Davis, was a mother like no other at that moment. She was going to do whatever she could to find her daughter.
The family of 22-year-old Tierra Lott has contacted the Buffalo police after receiving an ominous text message from the missing woman.
They explained that Tierra was in a vulnerable situation.
On FaceTime, she had a couple of bruises and marks.
Tierra told her sister that she was going to leave the house, but then Tierra sent a message saying, if anything happens to me, I love y'all. Tell everyone else. And after that, no one could reach her.
But the family doesn't get the response they'd expected.
The police acted as if she was an adult. She might have left on her own for a couple of days.
Tierra's family can't help but feel the response might have been different if she were white.
Tierra being a Black woman, those cases often slip through the cracks. They don't get the same attention from the media, from the police, as white counterparts do.
There is disparities, the white women syndrome, where they make national headlines overnight.
We're gonna find her.
Desperate to find Tierra, her family begins an investigation of their own.
We just took matters in our own hands and did what we had to do.
It was us doing the footwork, us putting the flyers and everything.
We just got our friends together, people that knew Tierra, family help. We was on the phone a lot, trying to get into her emails. Definitely wasn't eating, sleeping.
We was outside searching through all these abandoned houses, train tracks, just everywhere.
Looking and looking. It was really hard.
The family has little luck. But when they ask the local church across the street from the house where Tierra went missing, they get their first break in the case.
The church had several cameras affixed to its building.
The church was helpful with giving us the video.
As they scroll through the footage, the sisters see themselves arriving to check on Tierra.
They can't get in, the doors are locked, so they leave to go get Andre's family member to help them get inside the house. As they go to leave, an SUV also pulls away.
While the sisters are gone, that same SUV returns and backs into the driveway. It stays for a while and then it leaves again.
That's when we come back and all the doors are open.
More concerning, though, is what they don't see.
Tierra FaceTimed her sister from inside that house. She's never actually seen leaving, but when the family finally got inside, Tierra was gone. So now they fear Andre took Tierra away in the SUV.
we should have never even left, because that's what they was waiting for us to leave.
Despite what they've seen, the family tries to remain hopeful.
We still just think, okay, maybe he just jumped on her and he trying to just keep her hostage till the bruises and the swelling go down.
And they think the key to finding her could be inside the house from which she disappeared.
We got to get back into the house to see if it's anything that would help us.
When they return to the scene of the suspected crime, nobody is home, and it's surprisingly easy to get inside.
We got back into the house because the doors was unlocked.
But what they discover inside makes them far less optimistic.
Her coat was on the floor.
That's when I started to really like, oh no, he did something. Because it's wintertime. She not outside wandering around with no coat, no winter jacket on.
With new evidence in hand, the family meets with police again.
After what felt like forever for the family, police finally bring in missing person detectives.
Based on the information that her mother gave to us, we determined something possibly happened.
The detective reassures Tiara's family that their case is important to the department.
I'll make this one of my top priorities.
We were investigating. This was our top priority.
Even so, Tiara's family remains frustrated.
I don't feel like they were looking as hard as we were.
While police focus on tracking down Andre, the family continues their own search for Tiara, partnering with a local nonprofit called Bury the Violence.
Bury the Violence finds missing, runaway, trafficked, and exploited individuals, working with the intersex of domestic violence and homicide.
Well, thank you for your help.
Karima is impressed by Tiara's family's efforts.
The family did exactly what I would expect them to do. When you're looking for someone, it is very important to be persistent, because we know that in our community, we have to advocate for ourselves.
Bury the Violence uses their expertise to help make Tiara's case more visible.
We become our own media. Everybody has to utilize TikTok, make this go viral. But we also have to remember that in the picture, in the heavy traffic areas, passing it out, posting it up is also another option.
Thank God for them, because it put the pressure on, like, this is happening.
Before long, Tiara's story is all over the local news.
When you saw this mother go on TV saying, Tiara, if you're out there, mommy is here, we're gonna find you, that just hit the heart of so many people.
And the community comes out in droves.
The community was wonderful. People I didn't even know came out, searched with us for 2 days in the cold, 6-degree weather. People stepped up. It really helped. Really kept me grounded.
That's the city of good neighbors. They came together.
Behind the scenes, the police investigation is also picking up steam.
A family member of Andre's comes forward saying he wants to talk to police.
So, you have something you need to tell me?
He definitely felt guilty.
He couldn't take that pressure of holding back.
When I get over there, she's just laying there in a pool of blood.
After the disappearance of Tiara Lott, the only person of interest, her boyfriend, Andre Wiggum, is still at large.
They still wanted him for questioning.
But Buffalo police are about to get a big break in the case.
A member of Andre's family comes forward. Apparently, Andre had called him the night that Tiara went missing.
So, you have something you need to tell me?
Andre called me over.
Andre said something happened and he needed him to come to his house.
He was unsure what Andre wanted, but he showed up to help.
But when Andre led him to an upstairs bedroom, he wasn't prepared for what he saw.
Dang, man.
There was Tiara, dead.
He knew her. She was best friends to his sister, so he watched these girls grow up together.
Apparently, this had all started with an argument that got out of control.
I have to get out of here. I have to get out of here now.
During the argument, Andre got physical with Tiara. They parted to cool down, and when he was asleep, she packed her things. But before she could get out, he must have caught her and lost it.
And now Andre wanted him to help dispose of the body.
Dang, man. We gotta get some stuff. Come on.
He admits he went along with Andre's request.
Consider his state of mind or his perspective. My family member just committed this terrible crime, and now he's asking me to do something to help him. What happens to me if I say no? I thought that I knew who this person was, and now I don't. There's kind of like a survival response. I got to get out of here alive.
As he and Andre drove, there was little conversation.
First, they stopped and got some alcohol, and then they stopped and got trash bags and duct tape for the cleanup.
But when the men pulled back up to the house, it was clear they had a problem.
Tiara's sisters were there, so they sped off in the car, hoping the woman hadn't seen them.
And when they returned, the sisters were gone.
With the coast clear, they backed the SUV into the driveway and went inside.
But as Andre broke out the trash bags and duct tape, he felt a wave of panic wash over him.
Well, don't just stand there, man. Help me. I just can't, man.
He couldn't go through with it. He told Andre he'd have to clean it up on his own.
He doesn't know how much time passed before he saw Andre emerge at the top of the stairs.
Andre had Tiara's body slung over his shoulder, inside bags closed with duct tape.
He confesses that he didn't refuse to help Andre load the body into the vehicle.
It sounds like he tried to help as minimally as possible.
He was very forthcoming with us. He gave us a lot of information regarding that night and what transpired.
His story corroborates much of what police had already assumed.
By now, investigators had fully screened the surveillance video that the family had found at the church across from Andre's house.
What he told them seemed to match what they saw on the footage.
So, do you think you can give me the location and the address of where the body is located?
Yeah.
But what the detective really wants to know is where Tiara's body is now.
After a while, he did come up with a location.
Officers drive out to the area.
But when they look around, they find no sign of Tiara's body.
So the detective decides to get tougher.
So clearly, you know you gave me some false information. So you have two options. One, keep lying, and I pin all this on you, and you go to jail for the rest of your life. Or two, you can start telling the truth about everything. So start talking.
Okay, I'll show you where she's at.
He finally gives them a location near some railroad tracks not far from Andre's house.
As they approach the tracks, police have good reason to believe Tiara is near.
He did become uneasy, shaken, and everything.
He started to kind of get this visceral, this physical reaction. As long as she was hidden, he was able to hide in that denial. But as people start to get closer, he now has to realize that I'm associated with something heinous. How did I do it?
When a family member of Andre Wiggum leads Buffalo police to where he claims Tiara Lott's body was dumped, it doesn't take long to find her.
She was found dead on their train tracks.
But if it wasn't for him, police may have never found her body.
That particular neighborhood, there is a lot of dumping that has taken place in that area. Trash, tires,
So, perfect dumping ground, I guess, some would say.
Although Tiara's body has been out in the elements for 2 weeks, she is still identifiable.
It was February, and the city of Buffalo is very cold. So her body was very well preserved.
Now police face the difficult task of notifying her family.
In the case of Tiara, me and another detective did go over to the mother's house.
They basically said body was found on the train tracks. And I just fell into my kitchen cabinet. And I'm like, wow, not my daughter, not my child, not Tiara. Not Tiara.
I just heard my mom just bust out in tears, and I just held her. I just held my mom.
It was really hard. It was really hard. Unbelievable.
After hearing what Andre's family member told police, Tiara's loved ones don't doubt his story.
He grew up around Tiara like a sister.
He definitely felt guilty. Probably was his sister getting in his ear, saying like, you need to come forward. Far as his role, I don't think he had nothing to do with what happened all until her last breath. And Andre made him help move my sister's body.
They're also grateful that he was brave enough to tell the truth.
At the end of the day, that's his family. He had to make a choice, and I appreciate the choice that he did make for us to find her.
And because of that choice, no charges are filed against him.
The location he had my daughter at, I wouldn't have never found her. I lived in Buffalo all my life. I never even knew that location existed.
While it's not the ending the family hoped for, they are relieved to have Tiara back.
Now we can lay her to rest peacefully.
Tiara, slow down. What's going on?
But making any sense of Andre's crime feels impossible.
What's going on?
This attack, I don't know where it came from.
I'll kill you.
She never came to us and said anything about him putting his hands on her or anything.
But in retrospect, there was a sign that something wasn't right between the couple.
We never got a chance to meet him.
I was concerned for that. Why we can't meet him? Why you don't let him come by and see the family? She just said, he always busy, he doing this, he doing that. It was always something, an excuse.
Building that wall of resistance and not being available to share with your family is sometimes the red flag.
There's a tendency to hide, protect the abuser. And somebody who's abusive, they would not want to be around family or friends of the abused because they know that the person support network will sniff it out.
Her family suspects that embarrassment may have prevented Tiara from letting her family in.
She didn't want her mother to feel like she was being mistreated. She wanted her mom to always feel like she's still shooting for the stars, nothing is bringing her down.
There can be a lot of guilt and a lot of shame surrounding the abuse, which often causes people to keep it in.
Who you on the phone with?
And while no one knows what really happened behind closed doors, it's easy to imagine that abuse was happening all along.
It can start as something small, raising your voice, but that can escalate to physical violence.
And Tiara, like so many victims of abuse, stayed.
Victims kind of fall into this cycle with their abusers where they tell you that they're going to change. This won't continue to happen. Unfortunately, the abuser can be very manipulative, and it can be really hard for the victim to know what's real and what's not.
The fact that Tiara was trying to leave the day she was killed may have also contributed to the violence.
The most dangerous time for victims is when they try and leave an abusive relationship.
I have to get out of here.
Leaving someone who's controlling elicits kind of a panic response in the abuser. The abuser feels threatened. To him, strength is control. And if I don't have control, then maybe everybody will see how weak I am. So I need to shut you up, extinguish you.
When the autopsy results return, It's clear Tierra died a horrible death.
I read the autopsy, and he's the devil. Pure evil. Pure evil.
It was determined that Andre did strangle Tierra.
It takes multiple minutes to strangle someone. And during that entire time, you're looking at them in the face. You're watching the life leave their body. It's a very personal thing. He was definitely in a rage.
For Buffalo police, it's urgent to find this very dangerous man.
But police are still struggling to pin him down.
We had information that Andre may have left the state.
Desperate to find Andre, Buffalo investigators request outside help.
Buffalo police have no jurisdiction outside of New York State. So we enlist the help of marshals who have jurisdiction all over the U.S. So we brought them in, let them know what we have, gave them Andre's information, and from there they were able to help us search for him.
The family is grateful to see police finally making a more focused effort in Tierra's case.
Once they found her body, I do kind of feel like they were taking us more serious.
Nonetheless, Tierra's family remains deeply involved in the hunt to find him.
They wanted answers and started asking questions, and they were hearing that he's in the neighborhood, that he's driving around.
We found out that he was coming back and forth in Buffalo.
I was on the phone with the detectives and the marshals every day, giving them information.
But even with these new leads, authorities face serious hurdles in locating the suspect.
They believed the family of Andre Wiggum knew his whereabouts, and they were protecting him.
It was frustrating because Tierra's family felt like everyone was protecting this guy. Even that woman that supposedly lived in his house that kicked them out.
They also haven't been able to track him using cell phone data.
It seems Andre was changing out burner phones every so often, making it very difficult to find him.
In the meantime, with Andre still missing, the community remains on edge.
People are on alert, there's prayer, there's looking out for each other because we got to make sure we're all safe.
When someone is on the run and they've committed murder, they don't really have much else to lose. So if you do cross the wrong paths with them, I think it's valid to have some fear of what might happen.
More than a year goes by, and it seems Andre may never be found. But finally, he slips up.
Although he was smart about switching phones, there was an app he consistently used that the U.S. Marshals were able to trace.
After homing in on a Buffalo address, investigators stage a raid.
But when police enter the home, he's nowhere to be found. Andre escapes once again.
Roughly a year after Tierra Lott's murder, U.S. Marshals and Buffalo police believe they finally located their suspect, Andre Wiggum.
They had a house where he was hiding at.
But inside, there's no sign of him.
Police believe that he got wind that they were coming.
The near miss is a blow to the investigation and to the family.
Every day that you was out there getting away with something, you think you got one up and whatnot. It's like, that's not fair.
I did wish that on him. I felt as if I didn't want him to be found alive. You don't supposed to wish death on anybody, but this one time, this one time, because he took somebody so special from us.
But then, in May of 2022, Andre shocks everyone by turning himself in.
I think they had nowhere else to hide.
At this point, everyone knew he was wanted, and no one was willing to hide him anymore.
Knowing Andre is finally behind bars is a relief for Tiara's family.
I'm very, very happy that they did catch him.
I just wanted him to not be out here no more.
His arrest is also a hard-won victory for her loved ones who never gave up.
There is a sense of relief, a sense of accomplishments that we did it. Our efforts weren't in vain.
You have to advocate for yourself.
Fight for your child. Never give up. People turn their backs, close doors, keep banging, keep your foot on the ground, and keep going. But if I just would have laid there, wait for phone calls, this would have never got solved.
As the case moves to trial, Andre's lawyer contacts the DA's office about a possible plea.
Prosecutors were open to reducing the charges from second-degree murder to first-degree manslaughter.
Trials like this, lawyers can be brutal in defending their client. Things that they can say in a courtroom to kind of throw doubt.
Although Tiara's family isn't sure the plea deal is the best option, it would have one advantage.
Maybe it was better if I wouldn't have to hear every single detail.
Sometimes it makes more sense emotionally to accept the plea.
With a deal in place, Andre faces sentencing in June of 2023.
Me and my family, Tiara's family on her dad's side, was there in court.
When given the chance to address the court, Tiara's mother fearlessly faces Andre.
Her words were, "Never in a million years would I think he would be the one to take her life. She really did care about this man. Why did you do this? Why did you have to kill her?"
But Andre chooses to remain silent.
The judge asked him, did he want to speak? He said no.
He showed no remorse. It was no apology. It wasn't nothing.
And when the judge hands down a sentence of 25 years, the family feels like it's a slap in the face.
He shouldn't have got that.
25 is not enough time for what he did to my daughter.
I don't consider it as justice.
Because for those who love Tiara, there will always be a void.
He took away a daughter, a cousin, an aunt, a friend.
One of the kindest people like we have around. Just an amazing person to have in your corner.
Birthdays, holidays, even just meeting up at my mom's house, having family time. It's always gonna be that missing piece that we can never feel, ever. He just snatched that away from us. Makes me angry, because she's supposed to be here.
She definitely deserved to be here.
We always gonna keep her name alive. We gonna be her voice for her.
And her family has hope that Tiara's story will help other women who may be in a similar situation.
Pay attention to the red flags. If a guy is trying to control you, pull you away from your family, that is some type of abuse. And it's just the beginning. Let your family know what you're going through. Don't hide it.
Be more open, letting your loved one know exactly what's going on, keeping them in the loop.
It's harder to share with somebody that you know. There are a lot of different resources that can meet you where you're at. Speaking with a therapist, there are lots of different support groups for women in toxic relationships.
You can call 211. It'll connect you to the local resources.
But, it's not worth your life.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-7...
The call came in like countless others that night. A routine report that would soon become one of the most haunting mysteries investigators had ever faced. Somewhere in the darkness, a life had been taken. A family was about to receive news that would change everything. And a community would soon be left with a question that refused to disappear. Who killed Dorian Mann? For decades, that question remained unanswered. The name faded from headlines. The evidence grew cold. The memories of the case slowly disappeared beneath the weight of time. But behind the silence was a family still waiting, still wondering, still hoping that one day someone would uncover the truth. Because every cold case has a story. Every piece of forgotten evidence has a history. And every victim leaves behind a final mystery that someone, somewhere, is still trying to solve. The case of Dorian Mann was not just another unsolved homicide. It was a case surrounded by uncertainty, unanswered questions, and a painful silence that lasted far longer than anyone expected. A person was gone. A family was left searching for answers. And investigators were left chasing a shadow. When authorities first began looking into the circumstances surrounding Dorian Mann's death, they entered a situation that would become increasingly complicated with every passing day. The early hours after a homicide are often considered the most critical. Detectives race against time. Witness memories are fresh. Physical evidence is still waiting to be discovered. Every conversation, every movement, every unexplained detail can become the thread that leads to the truth. But in this case, that thread seemed impossible to find. The investigation moved forward with more questions than answers. Who had been with Dorian before the tragedy? What events led to the deadly moment? Was the person responsible someone known to him? Or was the answer hidden somewhere beyond the obvious? As investigators worked to reconstruct the final moments of Dorian Mann's life, they faced the same challenge that confronts detectives in every difficult homicide case: separating facts from rumors, evidence from assumptions, and truth from speculation. The community wanted answers. The family wanted justice. But time was already beginning to work against them. In the beginning, there were likely conversations that seemed important, names that needed to be checked, statements that needed to be verified, possible leads that required attention. Detectives followed every available path, hoping that one detail would break the case open. But homicide investigations are fragile. A witness who remembers one thing may later remember another. A clue that seems insignificant at first may become critical years later. And evidence that once appeared useless can sometimes become the key to unlocking the past. For Dorian Mann's family, however, the passing days brought a different kind of reality. The investigation continued, but their lives had already changed forever. A loved one was no longer coming home. A familiar voice was gone. A future that once seemed certain had suddenly been replaced by grief and unanswered questions. The pain of losing someone is difficult enough, but when a killer remains unidentified, when justice remains out of reach, the suffering takes on another dimension. There is no final chapter, no courtroom ending, no moment when a family can finally hear the truth and begin to heal. Instead, there's only waiting. And waiting became the reality surrounding the Dorian Mann homicide. As years passed, the case entered the category that every law enforcement agency fears: a cold case. The term sounds simple. But behind those words are years of frustration, unanswered phone calls, old files stored away, and families who continue to carry the weight of a tragedy long after the public has moved on. A cold case does not mean investigators stopped caring. It does not mean the victim was forgotten. It means the answers became harder to reach. It means the trail became quieter. It means the people who knew the truth had more time to hide it. For decades, the Dorian Mann homicide remained a painful reminder that some mysteries refused to disappear. While society moved forward, while technology advanced, and while new generations grew up unaware of the tragedy, one question remained frozen in time. Who was responsible? The passage of years created another challenge. People moved away. Relationships changed. Memories became less clear. Potential witnesses aged. And some individuals connected to the case may have believed that the passage of time had protected them forever. But investigators know something important about cold cases. Time does not erase everything. Sometimes it reveals what was missed. A forgotten conversation can resurface. A new witness can finally come forward. Advancements in forensic science can transform old evidence into new possibilities. And a case that once appeared impossible can suddenly begin moving again. For years, the Dorian Man homicide existed in that uncertain space between tragedy and justice. It was a case that remained open, even when answers seemed unreachable. The file may have grown older. The memories may have faded. But the victim's name remained. And for those who continued searching, the investigation never truly ended. Behind every cold case is a moment when everything changes. A new piece of information. A new technology. A new perspective. A discovery that forces investigators to look at the past differently. For Dorian Man's case, that moment would eventually arrive after decades of uncertainty. But before the breakthrough, before the final answers began to emerge, there were years of silence. Years of questions. Years when the case appeared trapped in history. The world often remembers the shocking cases, the ones that dominate television screens, the ones that fill newspapers, the ones that capture national attention. But many victims are connected to cases that never receive that level of attention. Their names remain known mostly by family members, investigators, and the people who refuse to let them disappear. Dorian Man became one of those names. A name connected to a mystery. A name connected to a search for justice. A name connected to a question that remained unanswered for far too long. The story of this homicide is not only about the person responsible. It is also about the long road toward truth. It is about the detectives who refused to close the door completely. It is about evidence waiting patiently for the right moment. And it is about a family that carried the pain of uncertainty for years, never knowing if they would ever understand what truly happened. Because the hardest part of a murder investigation is not always finding the person responsible. Sometimes the hardest part is keeping hope alive when every passing year seems to suggest that the truth may never come. But cold cases have a way of returning. They wait. They remain hidden in files, in memories, and in unanswered questions. And then, sometimes decades later, something changes. A forgotten detail becomes important. A mystery begins to unravel. And a case that everyone thought might remain unsolved forever begins moving toward the truth. For Dorian Man, that long-awaited moment would eventually arrive. But first, investigators had to return to the beginning. Back to the night when everything changed. Back to the evidence that was left behind. Back to the questions that had haunted this case for decades. Because somewhere inside that forgotten history was the answer. And someone knew the truth. The first hours after a murder often become a race against time. Every second matters. Every decision matters. Every detail matters. Because once a crime scene begins to change, once people begin to talk, once memories begin to shift, the truth can become harder to reach. And for investigators searching for answers in the death of Dorian Man, the path ahead would become a long and difficult journey through uncertainty, silence, and unanswered questions. The scene that greeted detectives was more than just a location where a crime had occurred. It was the final chapter of a life. A place where ordinary moments had suddenly turned into tragedy. A place where investigators had to search for meaning among fragments left behind. The smallest details became important. The position of objects. The timeline of events. The people who had been nearby. The conversations that happened before the tragedy. Nothing could be ignored. Because in a homicide investigation, the truth rarely announces itself. It hides. It waits. And investigators must uncover it piece by piece. At the beginning, detectives face the same challenge that has confronted countless investigators before them. They knew someone had lost their life. They knew someone was responsible. But they did not yet know why. The motive remained unclear. The suspect remained unknown. And the final moments of Dorian Man's life became the central mystery they needed to solve. Detectives began building a timeline. They worked backward. They searched for the last confirmed moments before everything changed. Who had seen Dorian? who had spoken with him, who might have information that could explain what happened. Every homicide investigation begins with a search for connections. The victim's relationships, the victim's routines, the victim's conflicts, the people who enter their world, the people who may have had reasons to hurt them. Investigators know that most crimes are not random. Somewhere behind the violence, there is usually a story, a disagreement, a secret, a personal connection, a moment that pushed someone toward an irreversible decision. The challenge is discovering which story is the truth. As detectives interviewed people connected to Dorian, they were searching for something more than answers. They were searching for inconsistencies, a statement that did not make sense, a timeline that did not match, a detail someone tried to avoid. In criminal investigations, small contradictions can become major discoveries. A person may forget a conversation. A person may misremember a time. A person may leave out information they believe is unimportant. But investigators look at those moments carefully, because sometimes the smallest crack in a story can reveal what someone is trying to hide. However, as the investigation continued, no immediate breakthrough came. The case began entering a dangerous period. The period after the initial shock. The period when public attention begins to fade. The period when a family realizes that answers may not come quickly. For the people who loved Dorian Mann, the investigation was not just a police case. It was their reality. Every day brought the same unanswered questions. Every anniversary reopened the pain. Every unanswered phone call from investigators carried the possibility of hope and disappointment at the same time. A homicide does not end when the crime scene is cleared. For families, it continues. The empty chair, the unanswered messages, the memories that remain frozen in time, and the question that never disappears. Why? As months turned into years, the case became more difficult. Potential leads became weaker. People moved on with their lives. The world around the investigation changed. New cases demanded attention. New crimes filled headlines. But somewhere inside an old investigative file, the name Dorian Mann remained. A reminder that an unsolved homicide is never truly forgotten by those seeking justice. For detectives, cold cases create a unique challenge. The passage of time can destroy evidence, but it can also preserve it. A piece of evidence overlooked decades earlier may suddenly become valuable because technology has changed. Scientific methods that did not exist before can reopen doors that appeared permanently closed. DNA analysis, digital databases, advanced forensic techniques, new approaches to old evidence. The tools evolve. And sometimes, the past finally begins to speak. But before any breakthrough could happen, investigators had to confront the reality of the case. There were gaps. There were unanswered questions. There were moments that remained unexplained. The story of what happened to Dorian Mann existed only in fragments. A collection of pieces waiting to be connected. The investigation became a search through shadows. And shadows are difficult to chase, because every possibility creates another question. Every theory creates another uncertainty. Investigators may consider multiple scenarios. Was this a crime of opportunity? Was it personal? Was someone protecting a secret? Was there a person who knew more than they admitted? Each possibility had to be examined. Each lead had to be tested. And each false path had to be eliminated. That is the reality of solving a murder. It is not a straight line. It is a maze. And sometimes investigators must walk through the same corridors again and again before discovering the hidden exit. As the years passed, Dorian Mann's case became one of those mysteries that seem trapped between the past and the present. A case where the victim's name remained connected to a question mark. A case where justice appeared delayed, but not impossible. Because history has shown that no cold case is truly dead. Some cases wait for decades before the right person speaks. Some wait for technology to catch up. Some wait for investigators to look again. And sometimes, the truth survives longer than anyone expects. For the detectives assigned to the case, the mission remained unchanged. Find the person responsible. Understand what happened. Give the family the answers they deserved. The passage of time could make the investigation harder. But it could never change the most important fact. A life had been taken. And someone was responsible. The silence surrounding the case created another mystery. Why had no one come forward? Was someone afraid? Was someone protecting another person? Or had the truth been hidden so carefully that even those closest to the situation did not know the full story? Those questions would continue haunting the investigation. Because in every unsolved homicide, there is a moment when investigators realize something frightening. The answer may not be far away. The person responsible may have been closer than anyone imagined. And the truth may have been hidden in plain sight. The years following Dorian Mann's death became a test of patience, determination, and persistence. The case survived because people refused to let it disappear. Behind the paperwork and evidence files was a person, a name, a family, a life that mattered. And while the world moved forward, investigators continued searching for the missing pieces. Because every victim deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves answers. And every unsolved case carries the possibility that one day, the silence will finally be broken. For Dorian Mann, the mystery was far from over. The investigation had entered a new phase. A phase where old questions would meet new possibilities. Where forgotten details could become critical. Where the past would begin revealing secrets that had remained hidden for years. And somewhere inside that long-forgotten case file, the first signs of a breakthrough were waiting to be discovered. The passage of time can be cruel. For investigators, time creates distance between the crime and the answers they are searching for. For families, time creates a different kind of pain, the pain of carrying a question that never goes away. And for a case like the Dorian Mann homicide, every passing year represented another chapter written without a conclusion. The world changed. Technology advanced. New generations grew up. But the mystery remained. Somewhere, hidden beneath decades of silence, was the truth. And investigators believed that truth had never disappeared. It had only been buried. When detectives return to an old case, they are not simply reopening a file. They are reopening a story filled with memories, unanswered questions, and moments that were never fully understood. They must look at everything again. Every statement. Every piece of evidence. Every decision made during the original investigation. Because time changes perspective. A detail that seemed meaningless years earlier can suddenly become the most important clue in the entire case. The challenge is knowing where to look. The Dorian Mann investigation had become a search through history. A reconstruction of events that had taken place long ago. Investigators had to ask questions that had already been asked before. But this time, they were looking for answers with new eyes. What had been missed? What had been overlooked? What had seemed impossible to prove years earlier? Cold case detectives often describe their work as solving a puzzle where many pieces are missing. They cannot change what happened. They cannot return to the original crime scene. They cannot speak to witnesses in the same way. But they can examine what remains. And sometimes what remains is enough. The review of an old homicide file often begins with one simple question. If this case happened today, what would investigators do differently? That question can change everything. Modern investigations rely on tools that did not exist decades ago. Evidence can be analyzed in ways that previous detectives could never have imagined. Old assumptions can be challenged. New connections can be discovered. A name mentioned once in an old report may now match information from another source. A forgotten statement may reveal a contradiction. A piece of physical evidence may finally provide answers. The past can become evidence, And in the Dorian Mann case, the past held secrets. As investigators examined the history of the case, they had to separate what was known from what was believed. The difference between those two things can determine whether a case is solved or remains open forever. Facts are permanent. Theories can change. Rumors can spread. Memories can become unreliable. But evidence tells its own story. The question was whether enough evidence remained to reveal the person responsible. For the people who had followed the case, the possibility of a breakthrough created a mixture of emotions. Hope. Fear. Curiosity. After so many years, answers could finally arrive. But answers also bring painful realities. Because solving a murder means confronting the darkest moments of the past. It means understanding what happened. It means learning the truth that families have waited years to hear. Sometimes justice brings relief. Sometimes it brings another wave of grief. But for families, the truth is still better than uncertainty. The unknown can be its own kind of suffering. Not knowing who was responsible. Not knowing why it happened. Not knowing whether the person responsible was still nearby. Those questions can follow people for a lifetime. The Dorian Mann homicide became more than an investigation. It became a symbol of every family waiting for answers. Every cold case carries the same message. A victim is never just a name in a file. Behind every investigation is a person who had dreams, relationships, memories, and a future that was taken away. That is why detectives continue working on cases that many people believe are impossible to solve. Because impossible does not mean hopeless. It only means the answer has not been found yet. As investigators continued examining the case, they focused on the details surrounding Dorian's final known moments. The timeline became critical. In a homicide investigation, time can be the difference between understanding what happened and remaining trapped by uncertainty. Where was Dorian? Who had contact with him? What events occurred before the crime? What changed in the moments leading up to the tragedy? These questions formed the foundation of the investigation. Because somewhere within those final moments was the key. The person responsible had made choices. They had moved. They had spoken. They had left something behind. Every action creates evidence. Every decision leaves a trace. Even when years pass, the truth can leave fingerprints on history. Investigators also understand another reality of cold cases. Someone often knows something. A friend. A witness. A person who heard a conversation. A person who noticed something unusual. A person who stayed silent. Many cold cases remain unsolved not because there are no answers, but because the answers are hidden behind fear, loyalty, or uncertainty. Sometimes people do not speak because they are protecting someone. Sometimes they do not speak because they believe it is too late. Sometimes they do not realize that the small detail they know could solve a decades-old mystery. That is why investigators continue appealing to the public. Because one conversation can change everything. One memory can reopen a case. One person deciding to finally speak can bring justice after years of silence. The Dorian Mann homicide remained a reminder of that possibility. The investigation was no longer only about what happened years earlier. It was about what could still be discovered today. As technology continued advancing, law enforcement agencies across the country began solving cases that once seemed impossible. Cold cases that had remained untouched for decades were suddenly moving forward. Families who had waited years were finally receiving answers. Arrests were being made. Truths were being revealed. The message was clear. Time does not always protect those responsible. Sometimes time gives investigators the opportunity to find them. For the Dorian Mann investigation, the long search continued. The case was no longer just a forgotten file. It was a living investigation. A mystery waiting for the final pieces. And every cold case detective knows that the smallest detail can become the turning point. A single piece of evidence. A single witness. A single moment when the past and present finally connect. The question was no longer whether the case mattered. It always had. The question was whether the truth was finally ready to emerge. Because behind the years of silence, behind the unanswered questions, behind the uncertainty that surrounded Dorian Mann's death, there was still a story waiting to be told. A story about what happened. A story about who was responsible. A story about justice delayed but never abandoned. And as investigators continued searching, one thing became clear. The case that many believe had been forgotten was not gone. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to look closer. Waiting for someone to speak. Waiting for the moment when the mystery would finally begin to unravel. For years, the Dorian Mann homicide existed in a place where many cold cases remained trapped between memory and mystery. It was a case that had never truly disappeared, but one that had slowly faded from public attention. The headlines stopped. The conversations became quieter. The urgency that surrounded the first days of the investigation became a distant memory. But behind the scenes, the questions remained. And for those still searching for answers, the passage of time did not represent an ending. It represented another challenge. Because every cold case has a moment when investigators must decide whether they are simply reviewing history or whether they are uncovering something that was waiting to be found. The difference can be everything. A forgotten file can become an active investigation again. A name written in an old report can suddenly become significant. A piece of information once dismissed can take on an entirely new meaning. And sometimes, the answer has been closer than anyone realized. The renewed examination of Dorian Mann's case required investigators to step back into the past. They had to return to the beginning. Not with assumptions. Not with theories. But with one objective. Find the truth. That meant carefully examining every available detail. The original reports. The witness accounts. The timeline of events. The information collected during the earliest stages of the investigation. Cold case detectives know that the first investigation is often conducted under enormous pressure. Families are demanding answers. The community wants reassurance. Investigators are working against time. The pressure to solve a crime quickly can sometimes mean that certain possibilities are not explored as deeply as they might be years later. Not because investigators failed, but because every investigation is limited by the information available at that moment. Years later, circumstances change. New methods become available. New perspectives emerge. And the same evidence can tell a different story. The Dorian Mann homicide became a case where the past needed to be re-examined through the lens of the present. Investigators began looking for patterns, connections, details that might have been overlooked. Because solving an old homicide often requires understanding not only what happened, but why previous efforts failed. What prevented the case from moving forward? Where did the investigation lose momentum? Which questions remained unanswered? Those questions became the foundation of the renewed search. The investigation moved slowly, carefully, methodically. There was no single dramatic moment that revealed the truth. Instead, progress often comes through small discoveries. A conversation, a document, a detail hidden inside hundreds of pages of information. Cold cases are rarely solved by one piece of evidence alone. They are solved when multiple pieces finally connect. And every connection brings investigators closer to the moment they have been searching for. The moment when uncertainty becomes understanding. One of the greatest challenges in an old homicide investigation is separating memory from reality. Over time, people remember events differently. A person may remember a conversation but forget the exact words. A witness may remember a feeling but not the details. A story repeated for years can slowly change. That is why investigators rely on evidence. Evidence does not age in the same way memories do. It does not change because time passes. It does not adapt because people tell different versions of events. It simply waits, waiting for someone to understand its importance. For Dorian Mann's family, the renewed attention brought emotions they had experienced many times before. Hope, but also uncertainty. Because every time a cold case gains attention, families face the same difficult reality. The possibility of answers means they must also face the possibility of painful truths. After years of waiting, closure is complicated. Families do not simply want an arrest. They want understanding. They want to know what happened in the moments they were not there. They want to know why someone they loved was taken away. And they want the world to remember that their loved one was more than a victim. Dorian Mann was a person, a life, a story, a future that was interrupted. That is why cold case investigations matter. Because justice is not limited by time. A case that remains unsolved for decades is not a case that no longer matters. It is a case where the search simply took longer. As investigators continued looking into the circumstances surrounding Dorian's death, they also considered one of the most difficult questions in any homicide investigation. Was someone hiding the truth? Sometimes the answer in a cold case is not found because evidence was missing. Sometimes it is missing because someone intentionally kept it hidden. Someone may have known more than they admitted. Someone may have avoided speaking. Someone may have believed that enough time had passed to escape responsibility. But time creates another danger for those who hide the truth. People change. Relationships change. Secrets become harder to protect. And eventually, someone may decide that silence is no longer worth carrying. Many cold cases are solved because someone finally chooses to speak. A person who once stayed quiet reaches a point where they cannot ignore what they know. A conscience becomes heavier than fear. A memory becomes too important to keep hidden. And when that happens, an investigation can change overnight. The search for answers in the Dorian Mann homicide continued through that possibility. Somewhere, someone might hold the missing piece. The challenge was finding it. Investigators also understood that every cold case has a human element beyond the evidence. There is a community affected by what happened. There are people who remember the fear and uncertainty. There are individuals who still wonder if the person responsible was ever held accountable. A violent crime changes more than one life. It changes everyone connected to it. The community surrounding the case carried its own memories. The shock of the original crime. The frustration of unanswered questions. The feeling that justice had been delayed. But delayed justice is not always denied justice. History has shown that cases can be solved years after the crime occurred. Technology can uncover what was invisible. Determination can overcome obstacles. And investigators can find answers where others only see a dead end. The Dorian Mann homicide remained a reminder of that possibility. A case once surrounded by silence was beginning to move toward a new chapter. The questions that had remained unanswered for years were being examined again. The evidence that had waited quietly was being reconsidered. And the investigation was approaching the moment every cold case hopes to reach. A breakthrough. But before the truth could finally emerge, investigators had to continue following the trail. They had to examine the connections, the people, the moments that shaped the final hours before Dorian Mann's death. Because somewhere inside those details was the key. Somewhere was the answer that had remained hidden for so long. And after decades of uncertainty, the forgotten case was about to reveal that it had never truly been forgotten at all. The most difficult cases are not always the ones with no evidence. Sometimes, the most difficult cases are the ones where the evidence exists, but the meaning remains hidden. A clue without context. A statement without confirmation. A piece of information that seems ordinary until someone finally understands why it matters. For years, the Dorian Mann homicide remained trapped inside that uncertainty. There were questions. There were possibilities. There were fragments of a story scattered across time. But there was no complete picture. And without that final connection, the the truth remained just beyond reach. Cold case investigators understand that every old homicide has two timelines: the timeline of the crime itself and the timeline of the search for justice. For Dorian Mann, those two timelines moved separately for years. One represented the final moments of a life. The other represented decades of investigation, unanswered questions, and determination. But eventually, those timelines had to meet. Because every cold case reaches a point where the past demands attention. The case files were more than documents. They were memories preserved on paper. Names. Dates. Observations. Questions that had been asked and questions that had never received answers. Investigators reviewing the case knew that somewhere inside those records was information that could change everything. The challenge was discovering what had been missed. Cold case detectives often describe their work as looking at an old photograph. At first glance, everything appears familiar. But when you study the image carefully, details begin to emerge. Something in the background. Something that does not belong. Something that changes the entire story. The same principle applies to investigations. A second look can reveal what the first investigation could not. As investigators continued examining the Dorian Mann homicide, they focused on the connections surrounding the case. Every person connected to a victim becomes part of the investigation. Friends. Acquaintances. People who crossed paths with the victim. People who may have seen something important but did not realize its value. Human memory is unpredictable. Someone can witness a moment and believe it is insignificant. Years later, that same memory can become the missing piece. That is why investigators never completely close the door on information. Because people remember things at different times. Sometimes a person speaks immediately. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes a person does not understand the importance of what they know until circumstances change. A cold case can remain silent for decades and then suddenly come alive because someone decides to talk. That possibility remains central to the search for answers. But solving an old homicide requires more than finding information. It requires proving it. Every theory must survive examination. Every accusation must be supported. Every piece of evidence must connect. Investigators cannot simply believe they know what happened. They must demonstrate it. That is the difference between suspicion and justice. For years, the Dorian Mann case existed in that difficult space between those two realities. There may have been questions. There may have been theories. But theories alone do not solve murders. Evidence does. And finding that evidence became the mission. The investigation also faced another challenge. The world around the case had changed. People who were once central figures in the story were older. Some memories had faded. Some circumstances had changed completely. The locations connected to the case may have looked different. The community itself had moved forward. But the investigation remained connected to one moment in time. The moment when everything changed. That is the strange reality of homicide cases. For investigators, time moves forward. But for families, part of their life remains frozen at the moment of loss. The calendar continues. The world continues. But one unanswered question remains. Who did this? As the investigation continued, detectives looked closely at the possibility that the answer had always been connected to someone within the existing circle of information. Many homicide cases follow a difficult pattern. The person responsible is often not a complete stranger. They are someone connected in some way. Someone who knew the victim. Someone who understood their routines. Someone who had access to their life. That possibility makes investigations even more complicated. Because detectives are not only searching for a person, they are searching for a relationship, a motive, a reason. Every homicide tells a story about human decisions, a moment when someone crossed a line that could never be undone. Understanding that moment is one of the most important parts of solving the crime. Investigators wanted to know what happened before the violence. What circumstances created the opportunity? What events led to the final confrontation? What information remained hidden? Those questions continued guiding the search. And as the case moved forward, the importance of modern forensic science became impossible to ignore. Technology has transformed criminal investigations. Evidence that once had limited value can now reveal information that investigators decades ago could never access. A small trace, a forgotten object, a piece of material preserved from the original investigation. What was once considered insignificant can become a powerful source of information. Science has given cold cases something they desperately need: a second chance. For the Dorian Man homicide, that second chance represented more than technology. It represented hope. Hope that the unanswered questions could finally be answered. Hope that the family could finally understand what happened. Hope that the person responsible could finally be held accountable. But cold cases are rarely solved quickly. Even when investigators find new information, they must carefully build the case. They must confirm. They must verify. They must follow every possible lead. Because after decades of waiting, the goal is not simply to solve the case. The goal is to solve it correctly. A wrongful accusation would create another tragedy. Justice requires patience. It requires accuracy. It requires the willingness to continue searching, even when the path becomes difficult. That determination kept the investigation alive. The Dorian Man homicide was no longer simply an old case from the past. It became a reminder that unanswered questions do not disappear. They remain. They wait. And eventually, they demand to be answered. As investigators continued digging deeper, the case began revealing signs that the silence surrounding it might finally be breaking. Old information was being reconsidered. New possibilities were emerging. The story was changing. And after years of uncertainty, the investigation was moving toward the moment that every family of a homicide victim hopes for. The moment when a cold case stops being a mystery. The moment when a forgotten name becomes the center of a search for justice once again. The moment when the truth begins to come into view. But before that could happen, investigators needed to uncover the final missing connections. The hidden details. The overlooked moments. The secrets that had remained buried for years. Because somewhere in the history of the Dorian Man homicide was the answer. And after all this time, the past was finally beginning to speak. For decades, the silence surrounding the Dorian Man homicide seemed impossible to break. A case that began with urgency had slowly become a mystery preserved in old reports and fading memories. But cold cases are never truly frozen. They are only waiting. Waiting for new information. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for someone to look at the past from a different angle. And sometimes, after years of uncertainty, the smallest detail can become the beginning of everything. The investigation into Dorian Man's death entered a new and critical stage. Detectives were no longer only asking what happened. They were asking why the answers had remained hidden for so long. Every unsolved homicide contains two mysteries. The first is the crime itself. The second is understanding why the truth remained out of reach. Was evidence overlooked? Was information misunderstood? Did someone choose silence? Or had the investigation simply been waiting for the right moment in history? These questions guided the renewed search. Because solving a cold case is not about chasing the past. It is about understanding it. Investigators began reconstructing the story again. Not as it was remembered, but as the evidence suggested. They examined the timeline. They reviewed the known movements surrounding Dorian's final hours. They searched for gaps, places where information did not connect, moments where questions remained unanswered. In any homicide investigation, a timeline can reveal what people try to hide. A person can change a story. A person can deny involvement, but time itself follows a pattern. Events happen in order. People move from one place to another. Actions create consequences, and investigators use that sequence to uncover the truth. The challenge was rebuilding a timeline that had been damaged by years of uncertainty. Memories had changed. Circumstances had changed. But the facts remained somewhere beneath the surface. The investigation also returned to the people connected to Dorian Mann. Every person in a victim's life represents a possible piece of the puzzle. Not because they're automatically suspects, but because every relationship provides information. A friend can reveal a routine. A neighbor can remember a conversation. An acquaintance can provide a detail that nobody else noticed. In a cold case, information does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it comes quietly. A sentence spoken years earlier. A memory suddenly remembered. A person deciding that the time has come to tell what they know. Investigators understand that human beings are complicated. Fear can keep people silent. Loyalty can influence decisions. Time can make people believe that certain secrets are buried forever. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, especially when justice remains unfinished. The search for answers in the Dorian Mann homicide continued with that reality in mind. Somewhere there could be a person who knew more. Someone who had information but never shared it. Someone who had convinced themselves that silence was easier. But silence does not erase responsibility. And time does not erase the need for justice. As the investigation progressed, detectives also looked at the physical evidence connected to the case. Evidence is often the strongest voice in a criminal investigation. It does not have emotions. It does not change its story. It simply waits for investigators to understand what it means. Advances in forensic science have transformed the way cold cases are investigated. Methods that were unavailable years earlier now allow detectives to revisit old evidence with new possibilities. Material once considered insignificant can become valuable. A sample once impossible to analyze can now provide answers. Technology does not solve cases by itself, but it creates opportunities. Opportunities that did not exist before. For families who have waited decades, those opportunities represent something powerful. Hope. The possibility that the unanswered questions may finally receive answers. The possibility that the person responsible may finally be identified. The possibility that the story of their loved one will no longer end with uncertainty. But investigators also knew that every new discovery required caution. Cold cases demand patience. A mistake after decades of waiting could create another injustice. Every lead had to be examined carefully. Every possibility had to be tested. Every conclusion had to be supported. Because the goal was not simply to find someone. The goal was to find the truth. That distinction mattered. As investigators continued their work, another question became increasingly important. What had happened in the moments before Dorian Mann's death? Those final moments often hold the key in homicide investigations. A conversation, a meeting, a decision, a confrontation. Something happened that changed everything. The person responsible did not appear from nowhere. There was a sequence of events, a path that led to the tragedy. Finding that path became the center of the investigation. Detectives searched for the turning point. The moment when a normal situation became something else. The moment when a decision was made that could never be undone. Because every homicide has a beginning before the violence. Understanding that beginning is often how investigators find the person responsible. The case also highlighted a painful reality faced by many families of homicide victims. The world often moves on. News cycles change. People become interested in new stories. But families remain connected to the same unanswered question. They do not have the luxury of forgetting. They carry the loss every day. For them, a cold case is not an old story. It is a current wound. And every development brings emotions that are difficult to describe. Hope mixed with fear. Relief mixed with pain. The possibility of closure mixed with the reality of what closure means. Because closure requires facing the truth. No matter how difficult that truth may be. The investigation into Dorian Mann's death continued because someone believed the truth was still there. Hidden. Waiting. But reachable. The case had survived decades because people refused to accept that silence was the final answer. Detectives continued searching. Families continued hoping. And the mystery continued to demand attention. Then came the possibility that changed the direction of the investigation. A new perspective. A new connection. A detail that had once seemed insignificant. Something that forced investigators to look again. Because in cold cases, breakthroughs rarely announce themselves. They often begin quietly. A single piece of information. A single discovery. A single moment when investigators realized they may have been looking in the wrong place. The Dorian Mann homicide had remained unanswered for years. But the case was no longer standing still. The forgotten file was becoming active again. The unanswered questions were being examined again. And the path toward the truth was beginning to appear. After all those years, the investigation had reached a critical point. The silence was beginning to crack. And behind that silence was a story that had waited decades to be told. The turning point in a cold case rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. There is no warning, no guarantee, no certainty that the next piece of information will finally solve everything. Instead, breakthroughs often begin with something small. A name, a forgotten detail, a question that was never fully answered. A piece of evidence that suddenly demands another look. For years, the Dorian Mann homicide existed in the shadows of uncertainty. But as investigators continued examining the case, those shadows began to move. The investigation was no longer only about what had been lost. It was about what could still be found. Cold case detectives know that every unsolved murder leaves behind a trail. Sometimes that trail is obvious. Sometimes it is almost invisible. But it exists. Every person involved leaves behind choices. Every action creates consequences. Every decision creates a connection. The challenge is discovering where those connections lead. The renewed investigation into Dorian Mann's death required investigators to think differently. The original questions remained important. But new questions had to be asked. What information had changed? What had technology revealed? What assumptions from the past needed to be reconsidered? Because time does something unexpected in criminal investigations. It can weaken memories. But it can also expose contradictions. People who once believed they could remain silent forever may find themselves facing new circumstances. Relationships change. Priorities change. The reasons people hide information can disappear. And sometimes, the truth emerges because the person carrying it can no longer keep it hidden. The investigation continued through that possibility. Every cold case contains the possibility of a witness who knows more than they originally admitted. A person who remembers something years later. A person who finally understands that a small detail could matter. A person who decides that silence has lasted long enough. For investigators, every new conversation represents a chance. A chance to discover what happened. A chance to understand what was hidden. A chance to bring answers to a family that had waited far too long. As detectives reviewed the details surrounding Dorian Mann's death, they focused on the story behind the crime. Because a homicide is not just an event. It is a chain of events. Something happened before the tragedy. Something created the circumstances. Something brought the victim and the person responsible into the same moment. Finding that connection became the key. Investigators began looking deeper into the timeline. The hours before the crime. The movements surrounding the incident. The decisions that led toward the final moments. A timeline can reveal what people do not say. A person may deny involvement. A person may change their story. But a timeline can expose impossible explanations. It can show where someone was, what they could have known, what they could have done, and what they could not explain. The search was not easy. Decades had passed. Information had been scattered. The investigation had to rebuild a story from pieces. But detectives working cold cases understand something important. The passage of time does not only create obstacles. Sometimes it creates opportunities. Technology had changed the way investigators approached old evidence. Forensic methods had advanced. Databases had expanded. Scientific analysis had become more precise. The tools available to detectives were far different from those available during the original investigation. A case that once appeared impossible could now have new possibilities. That possibility represented a second chance. Not only for investigators, but for Dorian Mann. Because every cold case is ultimately about a person whose story was interrupted. A person whose family deserves answers. A person whose name deserves to be remembered. As the investigation moved forward, detectives also understood the importance of public attention. Many cold cases survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. Family members, investigators, community members, people who continue asking questions even after years have passed. Their persistence keeps the search alive. Because time can make people forget, but determination can prevent that. The Dorian Mann homicide remained a reminder that justice does not have an expiration date. A case can remain silent for years, but silence is not the same as resolution. An unsolved murder is not a closed story. It is a story missing its final chapter. And investigators were searching for that missing chapter. The deeper they looked, the more important one question became. Was the answer hidden in something everyone had already seen? Many cold cases are solved because investigators discover that the truth was present all along. A detail that was misunderstood. A connection that was overlooked. A piece of information that did not seem important until everything else was considered. Sometimes the difference between an unsolved case and a solved case is not new evidence. It is a new interpretation of old evidence. That possibility changed the way investigators approached the Dorian Mann homicide. They were no longer simply searching for something new. They were searching for something overlooked. Something waiting to be recognized. The investigation also carried another difficult challenge. The emotional weight of reopening an old wound. For the family, every new development brought back memories that time had never erased. Years may pass, but grief does not follow a calendar. The loss remains. The questions remain. The need for answers remains. Families of homicide victims often describe the experience as living between two worlds. One where life continues, and another where part of them remains at the moment everything changed. That is why solving cold cases matters. Because justice is not only about punishment, it is about acknowledgement. It is about recognizing that a life mattered. It is about showing that the passage of time cannot erase the value of a victim's story. As investigators continued working, the possibility of a breakthrough became stronger. The case that had remained quiet for years was beginning to move. Old information was being reconsidered. New approaches were being applied. And the mystery surrounding Dorian Mann's death was beginning to lose the protection of time. But investigators knew the final answers would not come easily. Cold cases test patience. They test determination. They test the ability to continue searching, even when the path seems uncertain. The investigation required following every lead, even the ones that seemed unlikely. Because sometimes the smallest detail becomes the most important. A conversation, a document, a forgotten memory, a piece of evidence that had waited years for the right moment. And that moment was approaching. The case was entering a stage where possibilities were becoming stronger. where questions were becoming more specific, where investigators were no longer searching blindly. They were following a trail that had been hidden beneath years of silence, a trail that was beginning to reveal where the truth had been waiting. The Dorian Mann homicide had remained a mystery for decades. But mysteries do not always stay buried. Sometimes the past reaches forward. Sometimes forgotten stories return. And sometimes, after years of searching, the truth finally begins to reveal itself. The investigation was approaching the moment that every cold case hopes for. The moment when a name becomes a suspect. The moment when evidence becomes a story. The moment when justice begins moving closer. And after decades of unanswered questions, the silence surrounding Dorian Mann was about to be broken. There comes a moment in nearly every long-forgotten investigation when the weight of the past begins to shift. Not because the evidence suddenly changes, not because the crime somehow becomes easier to understand, but because the people searching for the truth begin asking different questions. For decades, investigators had asked who had crossed paths with Dorian Mann during those final hours, who had reason to remain silent, who had disappeared into the background as the years slipped away. Now another question became just as important. What had everyone accepted as fact without ever proving it? Cold cases often survive because assumptions become permanent. One investigator believes a witness. Another investigator inherits the file years later and accepts the same conclusion. The next detective reads the reports, trusts the earlier work, and unknowingly carries the same assumptions forward. Eventually, an opinion begins to resemble evidence. That is one of the greatest dangers in any homicide investigation. The team assigned to Dorian Mann's case understood that danger. They spread decades-old reports across conference tables. Photographs that had yellowed with age. Handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired. Witness interviews preserved on aging cassette tapes before being converted into digital files. Maps marked with circles, arrows, and questions that had never received answers. Every page represented someone else's attempt to solve the mystery. Every page also represented the possibility that something had been missed. One detective paused over a notation written in fading blue ink. Nothing extraordinary. Only a single sentence, followed by a question mark. It had never been answered. At the time, it appeared insignificant. Now, viewed alongside everything else, it no longer seemed insignificant at all. That is how cold cases change. Not with explosions. Not with dramatic confessions. But with quiet realizations. A detail ignored. A timeline corrected. A contradiction finally recognized. The investigation slowly began rebuilding itself. Instead of treating every witness separately, detectives examined how every account interacted with the others. Where did the stories agree? Where did they conflict? Which details remained consistent across multiple interviews conducted years apart? Consistency often survives time. Fabricated stories usually do not. As they reconstructed the chronology, investigators noticed something unexpected. Several witnesses remembered ordinary events remarkably well. Weather, traffic, the sound of a passing train, the time a local business closed. Small details remain surprisingly stable. Yet descriptions surrounding one specific period became unusually vague. People remembered before. People remembered after. But the critical window itself seemed blurred. That absence became a clue. Because sometimes what people fail to remember is more revealing than what they do. Investigators began wondering whether memories had naturally faded, or whether someone had influenced how those memories developed. Rumors can spread quickly after a violent crime. Communities search for explanations. People repeat conversations. Speculation slowly replaces certainty. Over enough years, even honest witnesses may struggle to separate what they personally experienced from what they later heard. That possibility required detectives to revisit every interview with extraordinary care. No assumption could remain untouched. Every conclusion had to earn its place. Meanwhile, the family continued living with uncertainty. Every renewed investigation reopened emotions they had spent years trying to manage. Each phone call from investigators brought hope. Hope could be dangerous. Hope meant expecting answers. Hope also meant risking disappointment once again. Friends often asked whether they still believed the case would ever be solved. The answer never changed. They had to believe. Without hope, the waiting would have been unbearable. For families of homicide victims, time behaves differently. Birthdays continue. Holidays arrive. Children become adults. Parents grow older. Entire generations change. Yet one chair at every gathering remains permanently empty. The passage of decades cannot erase that absence. It only teaches people how to live beside it. Investigators carry that reality with them. Every decision they made affected real people. Real memories. Real grief. The file on their desks represented more than evidence. It represented an unfinished promise. As the renewed investigation continued, advances in analytical software allowed detectives to organize thousands of pages of reports in ways impossible during the original inquiry. Patterns emerged. Connections became easier to visualize. Names appearing across multiple interviews suddenly stood out. Individuals once considered unrelated appeared linked through indirect relationships. None of those discoveries identified a killer, but they changed how investigators understood the landscape surrounding the crime. The case became less fragmented, more coherent. The pieces began fitting together. One detective described it as watching a photograph slowly come into focus. At first, only blurred outlines existed. Then shapes emerged. Then faces. Eventually, details impossible to recognize before became unmistakable. The investigation reached that stage. Questions grew sharper. Possibilities became narrower. Random chance gave way to deliberate analysis. The search was no longer expanding. It was closing in. Still, detectives remained cautious. Experience had taught them that confidence without evidence could destroy years of careful work. Every promising lead required independent confirmation. Every document had to withstand scrutiny. Every witness statement required comparison against objective facts wherever possible. Cold cases demand patience because mistakes become difficult to repair. The investigation therefore advanced deliberately, refusing shortcuts. Outside the investigation, public awareness slowly returned. Local newspapers revisited the forgotten homicide. Community members who had barely remembered the case suddenly found themselves discussing it again. Some searched through old family photographs. Others rediscovered newspaper clippings tucked in side drawers. Memories resurfaced in unexpected places. A retired shop owner remembered an unusual conversation. A former neighbor recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles during that period. A person who had once dismissed an observation as meaningless now wondered whether investigators should hear it. Not every recollection proved valuable. Many led nowhere. Some contradicted established facts. Others simply reflected the imperfections of memory. Yet detectives welcomed them all. Because no investigator can predict which overlooked detail may become decisive. One truthful sentence hidden among hundreds of mistaken recollections can transform an investigation. The renewed attention also created pressure. If the case remained unsolved after another major review, many feared it might never move forward again. Investigators understood those expectations. They also understood something equally important. Justice cannot be rushed. A weak case serves no one. Not the victim. Not the family. Not the truth. Every conclusion had to rest on evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny. That principle guided every decision. Weeks became months. Months became another chapter in the investigation. The file continued growing. New interview transcripts joined decades-old reports. Fresh forensic reviews sat beside original laboratory records. The investigation had become a bridge connecting two generations of detectives, those who first searched for answers, and those determined to finish what others had begun. Slowly, the distance between past and present narrowed. The unanswered questions that had defined the Dorian man homicide for decades became fewer. Not because investigators possessed every answer, but because they finally understood which questions truly mattered. Some mysteries that once seemed enormous proved irrelevant. Others, barely noticed during the original inquiry, became central. Perspective had changed. The investigation had changed with it. One evening, after another long review session, the lead detective stood before the evidence board in silence. Lines connected names, dates, locations, fragments of conversations, photographs, reports. Individually, none of them explained the murder. Together, they formed something different. A narrative. Incomplete, but no longer chaotic. For the first time in decades, investigators believed they were no longer chasing every possibility. They were pursuing one increasingly coherent path. Somewhere along that path lay the answer that had escaped generations of investigators. Somewhere along that path waited the final piece capable of transforming suspicion into certainty. And although no one inside the investigation dared say it aloud, they all sensed the same thing. The case had entered its final stretch. The silence that had protected the truth for so many years was beginning to collapse under the weight of persistence, careful investigation, and time itself. The forgotten homicide of Dorian Man was no longer simply a mystery waiting to be remembered. It was becoming a mystery that could finally be solved. Every cold case reaches a point where investigators stop asking whether the truth exists. Instead, they begin asking whether they are finally close enough to see it. That shift is almost impossible to recognize from the outside. There are no flashing lights, no dramatic press conference, no announcement that the mystery is nearly over. Inside the investigation, however, the atmosphere changes. Conversations become more deliberate. Questions become more precise. The endless search begins narrowing into a single direction. For the detectives working the Dorian Man homicide, that moment arrived quietly. After months of reviewing decades of material, they no longer believe the case was a collection of unrelated fragments. They believe it was one story, a story interrupted by fear, hidden by time, and obscured by incomplete understanding. The challenge was proving it. One wall inside the investigation room became covered with chronology. Not theories, not speculation, only confirmed events. Every verified movement, every documented conversation, every established point in time. The detectives deliberately removed assumptions that had accumulated over the years. If something could not be supported by evidence, it disappeared from the timeline. What remained was surprisingly simple. And simplicity often reveals what complexity conceals. When unsupported theories vanished, several long-held beliefs collapsed with them. Some people once considered important no longer appeared central. Others, barely mentioned during earlier reviews, suddenly occupied critical positions within the reconstructed sequence. The investigation had not changed the past. It had changed the investigator's understanding of the past. That distinction mattered. Human beings naturally search for dramatic explanations. But homicide investigations rarely unfold like fiction. The truth is often ordinary before it becomes tragic. Routine conversations, everyday decisions, normal movements. Then one irreversible moment changes everything. Detectives believe the same pattern existed here. Somewhere inside an otherwise ordinary day, events had taken a fatal turn. Finding that turning point became their primary objective. Meanwhile, specialists continued examining preserved evidence using modern forensic methods unavailable when the investigation first began. Every item was approached with renewed caution, not because investigators expected miracles, but because scientific limitations from decades earlier no longer defined what was possible. Evidence that once produced no meaningful results might now answer entirely different questions. Even when laboratory examinations failed to produce decisive breakthroughs, they still served an important purpose. Each result eliminated possibilities. Each exclusion narrowed the field. In investigations, knowing what did not happen can be nearly as valuable as knowing what did. The circle gradually became smaller. The unknown slowly became manageable. Outside the laboratory, detectives returned once again to conversations. Not interviews conducted years ago. New conversations. Fresh perspectives. People age. Lives change. Circumstances evolve. Someone unwilling to speak decades earlier may view the world differently today. Fear weakens. Loyalty fades. Personal burdens become heavier. Investigators never underestimate the power of conscience. Some secrets become more difficult to carry than to reveal. One retired detective, invited to discuss the original inquiry, offered an observation rather than evidence. He remembered leaving the investigation years earlier with one persistent feeling. He believed the answers had always been closer than anyone realized. At the time, he could not prove it. Experience simply told him something about the case felt incomplete. The new investigative team respected that instinct. Not because instinct solves murders, but because experienced investigators often recognize patterns difficult to explain. Still, instinct alone could never become part of the official case. Everything required verification. Everything required proof. That discipline separated investigation from speculation. The Dorian Man homicide demanded nothing less. As public attention slowly returned, local residents began sharing forgotten memories. Old diaries surfaced from storage boxes. Family photo albums unexpectedly captured backgrounds investigators had never previously examined. Letters preserved for sentimental reasons suddenly became historical records. Most contained nothing relevant. A few raised new questions. Cold cases possess an unusual relationship with ordinary objects. An old receipt, a calendar, a handwritten address. Items ignored for decades can suddenly establish timelines impossible to reconstruct any other way. Investigators treated every discovery with equal seriousness. Not because every discovery solved the case, but because no one could predict which detail would become indispensable. The family watched these developments cautiously. They had experienced renewed hope before. Each review had promised possibilities. Each ultimately returned them to uncertainty. This time felt different. Not because investigators offered guarantees. They refused to do that. Instead, the difference came from persistence. The questions were sharper. The methods more advanced. The investigation more focused. For the first time in years, the search seemed to possess direction rather than momentum alone. Even so, justice remained uncertain. Every homicide investigation eventually arrives at a difficult threshold. Believing something happened is insufficient. Knowing something happened is insufficient. Proving it beyond reasonable doubt becomes the true challenge. Evidence must withstand examination. Witnesses must remain credible. Every conclusion must survive intense scrutiny. Cold cases often fail at this final stage, not because investigators lack determination, because time inevitably removes opportunities. Witnesses pass away. Physical evidence deteriorates. Memories become vulnerable. The law demands certainty. Investigators understood that burden. If they reached the end of the investigation, they intended to arrive with a case built upon facts rather than confidence. As weeks passed, subtle changes appeared within the investigative files. Question marks disappeared. Timelines grew clearer. Cross-references expanded. The enormous uncertainty that once surrounded the case gradually concentrated around fewer and fewer unresolved issues. The mystery itself was becoming smaller. One detective described the process as watching fog lift from a familiar landscape. The landscape had always existed. Investigators simply had not been able to see it clearly. Now roads became visible. Landmarks emerged. The direction forward no longer seemed impossible. Late one evening, after reviewing another collection of archive material, the investigative team noticed something unexpected. Not a dramatic revelation. Not undeniable proof. A consistency. One detail appeared independently across separate sources created years apart. None of the original investigators had connected them. Viewed together, however, the repetition became difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The discovery demanded additional examination. It also required restraint. Coincidences sometimes resemble evidence. Evidence sometimes resembles coincidence. Only careful investigation distinguishes one from the other. That discipline defined every step forward. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Only verification. Piece by piece. Document by document. Conversation by conversation. The search continued. The forgotten homicide had now become one of the department's highest priorities. Not because it was the newest investigation. Because it represented unfinished justice. Every detective understood the responsibility. Some crimes test investigative skill. Others test endurance. The Dorian Man homicide demanded both. Years earlier, many believed the truth had disappeared forever. Now that belief no longer seemed certain. The investigation had reached a stage where answers appeared possible. Not inevitable, but possible. And possibility changes everything. Hope returned cautiously. The family waited. Investigators persisted. The community watched. Behind decades of silence, the truth remained hidden, but no longer unreachable. For the first time in a generation, those closest to the investigation believed that the final chapter of the Dorian Man homicide might not belong to mystery after all. It might finally belong to justice. After decades of unanswered questions, the investigation had reached the point every detective both hopes for and fears. Hope, because the truth finally seemed within reach. Fear, because every conclusion now carried enormous consequences. A cold case is different from an active investigation. It has survived years of scrutiny. It has accumulated assumptions, theories, rumors, and forgotten memories. Separating those layers from the facts requires extraordinary discipline. The investigators working the Dorian Man homicide understood that they could not allow excitement to replace evidence. Every discovery demanded confirmation. Every conclusion required another review. Every possibility had to survive challenge. That process consumed weeks, then months. The investigation became less about searching for new information and more about testing everything they believed they had learned. Could the timeline withstand independent examination? Did witness recollections align with documented events? Did physical evidence support the reconstructed sequence? Could every important question be answered without speculation? Only after each answer survived scrutiny could detectives move forward. Inside the investigation room, walls once covered with dozens of competing theories now displayed something different. Clarity. The sprawling maze that had frustrated generations of investigators had narrowed into a single working reconstruction. Not perfect. Not complete. But coherent. For the first time, every verified piece of information pointed in the same general direction. The detectives knew better than to celebrate. Experience had taught them that investigations often appear strongest immediately before unexpected complications emerge. So they challenged themselves. One investigator argued against the prevailing interpretation. Another searched deliberately for evidence that could disprove it. Every conclusion was attacked from multiple angles. If it survived those challenges, confidence increased. If it failed, the process began again. This deliberate skepticism protected the investigation. The objective was never to prove a preferred theory. The objective was to discover the truth, wherever it led. That philosophy had carried the case further than anyone expected. The renewed review also highlighted something that had haunted the investigation from the very beginning. Silence. Not simply the silence left by the passing years. The silence surrounding key moments. Questions that had never received complete answers. People who remembered only fragments. Conversations interrupted by uncertainty. Investigators came to believe that the missing pieces were not necessarily hidden. They were scattered. No single person possessed the complete story. Each individual carried only one part, one memory, one observation, one seemingly insignificant detail. Individually, those details meant little. Together they formed something much larger. Like assembling thousands of pieces from a shattered mirror, investigators slowly rebuilt a reflection of the past. The picture remained incomplete, but enough had emerged to reveal its shape. The family sensed the change before anyone said a word. Detectives remained careful with their language. They avoided promises. They refused to predict outcomes. Yet their questions had changed. Earlier conversations focused on broad possibilities. Recent conversations centered on specific moments, specific relationships, specific sequences of events. The investigation was no longer wandering through uncertainty. It was following a defined path. Hope returned cautiously. Hope can be dangerous after years of disappointment. Still, hope remained impossible to suppress. Every phone call from investigators carried new significance. Every request for clarification suggested progress. Every review of preserved evidence hinted that the story might finally be approaching its conclusion. Outside the investigation, community interest continued growing. Journalists revisited forgotten newspaper archives. Residents shared memories once considered too ordinary to mention. Former investigators reflected upon decisions made years earlier. Some questioned whether different choices might have changed the course of the case. Others reminded themselves that investigations can only rely upon the tools and knowledge available at the time. Looking backward always creates the illusion that missed opportunities were obvious. In reality, they rarely are. The detectives who first worked the Dorian Man homicide had confronted uncertainty with limited resources. Those continuing the investigation benefited from decades of scientific and investigative progress. The pursuit of justice had become a relay rather than a sprint. One generation carried the case as far as it could. The next continued from there. That continuity mattered. Cold cases are rarely solved by one extraordinary detective. They're solved through persistence across generations. Each investigator contributes something. A report. An interview. A preserved piece of evidence. An unanswered question left for someone else to revisit years later. The Dorian Man homicide had become exactly that kind of investigation. Its survival depended upon determination rather than luck. As forensic specialists completed another series of examinations, detectives compared every result against the reconstructed timeline. Nothing existed in isolation. Evidence gained meaning only when viewed alongside everything else. One inconsistency could alter an entire interpretation. One overlooked connection could explain years of confusion. Gradually, contradictions disappeared. The narrative became stronger, not because investigators forced the evidence into place, because independent pieces increasingly supported one another. Confidence grew quietly, never publicly, never dramatically, only within the careful language of investigative reports. Phrases changed. Possibility became probability. Uncertainty became consistency. The investigation approached the threshold separating suspicion from proof. Even then, detectives remained patient. The law requires more than belief. It demands evidence capable of surviving the highest level of examination. Every document prepared for prosecutors would eventually face defense attorneys determined to expose weakness. Investigators welcomed that challenge. If their conclusions could not withstand criticism, they were not ready. So they continued refining every detail, reviewing every statement, confirming every date, verifying every movement. No assumption remained untouched. The family waited through yet another season. Years had taught them endurance. Still, this waiting felt different. Not easier, more focused. The uncertainty that had once stretched endlessly now seemed concentrated into a final series of unanswered questions. Answers appeared closer than ever before. The emotional burden remained enormous. No investigation, however successful, could return what had been taken. Justice cannot reverse loss. It cannot restore birthdays missed. Conversations never shared. Lives never lived. What justice can do is acknowledge the truth. It can recognize responsibility. It can affirm that the victim's life mattered enough for strangers to spend decades searching for answers. That realization motivated everyone involved. The investigation was no longer simply about solving an old homicide. It had become a promise kept. A promise that time alone would never erase accountability. As the case entered its final investigative phase, every participant recognized the significance of the moment. Retired detectives watched from afar. Laboratory specialists reviewed their work repeatedly. Prosecutors examined developing evidence with meticulous care. The family waited quietly. The community followed every development. No one knew exactly how the story would end. But everyone understood one thing. The forgotten silence surrounding the Dorian Man homicide had finally been broken. The mystery that had endured for decades no longer seemed untouchable. The investigation had transformed uncertainty into direction, scattered fragments into a coherent narrative, and fading memories into renewed purpose. Only one final step remained: to determine whether everything uncovered through years of persistence, patience, and relentless investigation would be enough to reveal the truth beyond question. The answer had never felt closer. And after a lifetime of waiting, the final chapter was finally beginning to unfold. Every unsolved homicide leaves two victims. The first is the person whose life was taken. The second is the truth itself. For years, sometimes for decades, that truth remains buried beneath silence, fading memories, unanswered questions, and the relentless passage of time. The Dorian Man homicide had become exactly that kind of mystery. Not because investigators stopped searching, not because the family stopped caring, but because the truth refused to reveal itself, until it finally began to emerge. Not through one dramatic confession, not through one miraculous discovery, but through persistence, patience, discipline, the willingness of generation after generation of investigators to refuse a simple answer. The final phase of the investigation was unlike its beginning. The frantic urgency of the first days had long disappeared. In its place was something quieter, methodical, calculated. Every conclusion was challenged, every assumption questioned, every remaining uncertainty examined one final time. Detectives understood that solving a cold case required more than identifying a likely explanation. It required constructing a version of events supported by evidence from beginning to end. Nothing could be left to imagination. Nothing could depend upon hope. Every piece had to fit. The investigative team reviewed the complete chronology once again. Years of work stretched across tables covered with reports, photographs, laboratory findings, interview transcripts, handwritten notes, and timelines connecting events separated by decades. What had once appeared chaotic now resembled a complete picture. Not because every mystery had vanished, because enough questions had finally been answered. Cold case investigations rarely provide perfect endings. Time changes evidence. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade. Some answers are simply lost forever. Experienced investigators accept that reality. Their responsibility is not to recover every forgotten detail. Their responsibility is to uncover the truth that can still be proven. That distinction guided every decision. The family had waited through birthdays, anniversaries, holiday gatherings marked by an empty chair that never stopped reminding them of what had been taken. They had learned to continue living, but they had never learned to stop wondering. Every year carried the same unanswered question. Would this finally be the year? Would someone finally explain what happened? Would Dorian's story ever receive the ending it deserved? The investigation could not erase those years. No courtroom. No official announcement. No legal proceeding could restore the time stolen by uncertainty. Justice cannot rewrite history, but it can confront it. It can replace unanswered questions with established facts. It can acknowledge that a victim's life mattered enough to pursue the truth for as long as necessary. That principle became the heart of the investigation. The detectives often reminded themselves that cold cases are measured differently from ordinary investigations. Success is not defined by speed. It is defined by persistence. A case remaining unsolved for decades does not represent failure if investigators continue searching. Failure occurs only when the search ends before the truth has been given every opportunity to emerge. The Dorian Man homicide never reached that point. The search continued. Through changing technology, through changing investigators, through changing generations. Each detective inherited more than evidence. They inherited responsibility. Responsibility to continue asking questions others had been unable to answer. Responsibility to preserve what previous investigators had already discovered. Responsibility to remember that behind every report was a human life. The renewed investigation demonstrated another important lesson. Justice evolves. Scientific advances transform possibilities. Investigative techniques improve. Information once impossible to analyze becomes meaningful. Connections once invisible become clear. Time, often considered the greatest enemy of criminal investigations, can also become an unexpected ally. Not because it forgives, because it reveals. People change. Circumstances change. Technology changes. Eventually, the distance between the crime and the truth begins to shrink. For the community, the Dorian Man homicide had become more than an old case. It became part of local history. A reminder that violence leaves scars extending far beyond one family. Communities remember. Perhaps not every detail. Perhaps not every date. But they remember the feeling, the uncertainty, the conversations, the belief that somewhere, someone knew more than they had ever admitted. That belief sustained hope. Hope survived because history repeatedly proves one simple fact. Cold cases can be solved. Not all of them, but enough to remind investigators never to surrender. Some answers wait years. Others wait generations. The calendar does not determine whether justice remains possible. Evidence does. Determination does. The refusal to abandon the search does. The Dorian Man investigation ultimately became a story about that refusal. A refusal to let silence become the final answer. A refusal to allow the victim's name to disappear inside forgotten archives. A refusal to accept that time alone should protect the truth. Throughout the investigation, one lesson appeared again and again. Small details matter. A forgotten conversation. A preserved document. A carefully stored piece of evidence. A witness who finally remembers. None seem extraordinary on their own. Together, they become history speaking. Investigators listened carefully. They allowed facts rather than assumptions to guide them. That patience transformed uncertainty into understanding. As the investigation reached its conclusion, one realization became impossible to ignore. The true legacy of a case extended beyond its outcome. Whether measured by arrests, court proceedings, or official findings, another achievement already existed. The victim had not been forgotten. That matters. Families often fear something almost as much as the crime itself. They fear the world moving on. They fear newspapers stopping their coverage. They fear old files gathering dust inside forgotten storage rooms. They fear their loved one becoming nothing more than another unsolved statistic. The Dorian Mann investigation rejected that possibility. Every renewed review declared something important. Every detective who reopened the file made the same statement without speaking it aloud. This life still matters. This story still matters. This search still matters. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson every cold case leaves behind. Justice is not measured only by verdicts. It is measured by commitment, by the willingness to continue searching after headlines disappear, by investigators who refuse convenience, by families who refuse despair, by communities unwilling to forget. The passage of time may dim memories. It may weather documents. It may silence witnesses. But it cannot erase the simple truth that every victim deserves answers. Every family deserves honesty. Every unanswered homicide deserves one more question, one more review, one more investigator willing to begin again. The story of Dorian Mann is ultimately not just a story about mystery. It is a story about endurance, about the extraordinary determination required to pursue justice long after the rest of the world has turned its attention elsewhere. It reminds us that truth has remarkable patience. It can remain hidden. It can wait quietly beneath decades of uncertainty. But it has an extraordinary way of demanding to be found. And perhaps that is why cold cases continue to fascinate investigators, journalists, and ordinary people alike. Because they remind us that the past is never entirely gone. Every unanswered question leaves an echo. Every forgotten file carries possibility. Every unsolved homicide remains an unfinished sentence waiting for its final words. Some mysteries are solved quickly. Others require a lifetime. But as long as someone is willing to ask one more question, examine one more piece of evidence, or reopen one more forgotten file, the search continues. And somewhere beyond the silence, beyond the years, and beyond the weight of time itself, the truth continues waiting for the moment when it can finally be heard.